Hi, this is Terrell Sales, reporting on Chapter 16, Summative versus Formative Assessment. I wanted to really touch on this particular chapter because I remember from my readings in my master's program about an author named Richard Stiggins who really touched on this. Um, I thought that the chapter was really good, but my only critique is I don't think that it really touched on social justice and what that looks like within the context of inner cities or low income communities. So this particular part of the presentation is going to kind of focus more so on the social justice aspect of assessment for learning or assessment of learning. And that's what Richard Stiggins really wants to focus on in his writings. And I left the links and the reference materials in the back of this PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and get started. But I like this particular quote here. It says, "When it comes to assessment, we have been trying to find answers to the wrong questions." That kind of takes me back to the reading that we were doing, a more beautiful question. So what questions should be asked? And the question that I asked personally was, where's the tie into social justice, or where's the tie into students from low-income communities? So from there, I just want to kind of break down assessment of learning versus assessment for learning. And we kind of saw that assessment of learning is more so dealing with summative assessments that target student achievement. And that's more so on a broad scale. It's not on an individualized scale, right? Most of these summative assessments were ushered in by the NCLB. And we saw the high stakes testings and all those things that brought along with it. And with that, what it does is it provides data on quality of schools, not necessarily the quality of instruction. So again, it goes back to that broad scale. It's not individualized. And then ultimately, it's like a report card, basically. It's just evidence of achievement for the public to view or for public reporting. So API scores and different things like that. And then as that trickles down into the classroom, we see more summative assessments where it's just what the students know. Not how they know what they know, but just can they regurgitate what they know. And it's usually in the form of some type of assessment, whether it's state issued, district issued, school issued. But now we want to kind of focus on assessment for learning. But before we get there, I just want to ask this question for you guys to answer. How can we maximize the positive impact of summative assessment scores on learners? So again, we see how summative assessments deal with the broader scale, but we want to get more to a specific scale for the students individually as learners. So how can we maximize, because there are some positive things that come from summative assessment. I'm not saying do away with those altogether, but for our students or students in low income communities, we know that these particular tests necessarily don't reflect the highest grade of pertinent information pertaining to those particular students. So with that, how can we maximize the positive impact of summative assessment scores on learners? Okay, so from there, this is another great quote from Richard Stiggins. It says, "The problem is that such tests, ostensibly developed to leave no student behind, are in fact causing major segments of our student population to be left behind." And I want you guys to kind of ponder on that. And I want you to think of the faces, and I want you to think of the places of where those students are that are generally left behind by these high stake tests, or these tests designed to not leave students behind, but they more function as a test that, again, it's like a report card for everyone. It's not necessarily specific focus on students. So let that sink in. I want you guys to kind of think about that. You could chime in, you can write about that. But what faces, what places, demographics, what pops to your mind when you read this particular quote about those students who are being left behind by these high stakes tests or these summative assessments? Now we want to kind of go into assessment for learning. The chapter did a really good job about talking about what formative assessment is and the benefits of formative assessment. But then again, like I said, one of the shortcomings that I believe that was left out was the benefits for a particular group of people or a particular group of students, more so students from low-income communities. We see that informative assessments, meaning assessment for learning, assessments that informs the teacher's learning, involvement of students in the assessment process. That is a huge factor where students are giving formative feedback or informative feedback to teachers about their learning and how they're learning and their learning styles. And the teachers taking that information and utilizing within the classroom to fit the students' needs. Also, you use data from a continuous classroom assessment to advance, not just check on student learning. So it's not just a checkpoint or a check for understanding to see if students know the material. We're actually looking at student learning. How do they learn? And what best helps them learn? So we're using the data that we collect through teacher-created assessments within the classroom to help the teachers themselves inform their learning and inform their teaching practices to meet students where they are. So this is more so assessment for learning. It's tailored to help the teacher teach better. And it also has a greater emphasis placed on teachers' ability to create meaningful assessments to inform learning and teaching in the classroom, which is what I already stated. So with all these things, that assessment for learning, which the article did an excellent job talking about, but again, I don't think that it took the time to really be specific with who it was talking about. So with that, what population of students do you think will benefit most from formative assessment practices? This is something, if this is the goal of assessment for learning or formative assessment practices, what population of students do you think will benefit most from formative assessments? I would like you guys to answer that as well. I have some more questions for you to consider, all right? If we're really talking about students and we're thinking about students, there's certain things that variables that have to come into play, like student disposition, student attitude, student understanding, students feeling welcome within a classroom. There's a myriad of things that goes along with this, with assessment for learning, more so than assessment of learning. So here's some questions that I want you guys to consider. So how can we use assessments to help all our students want to learn? Because as we saw within the particular reading, that the majority of these assessments are tailored for a certain type of student. High stakes testing is tailored for a certain type of student that's used to thriving in that type of high stakes environment, high emotion environment where they thrive off of those types of things. Not all students thrive off of that, and we know that to be true through research and through the data. That just the mention of a test can send anxiety through students, and not a healthy anxiety, but an anxiety that's very fearful, right? So then also, how can we help them feel able to learn? So the type of students that we're talking about, again, some of them come into the classroom with preconceived notions regarding education, regarding their abilities. So how can we help them feel able to learn through assessment practices? Again, which form of assessment practices would lead to these perceived results? So would it be summative assessments? Would it be formative assessments? Would it be some combination of the two? And can assessments have greater impact within the classroom? Teacher to student level, students to student level, teacher to parent level, student to parent level, and then ultimately from that level to administration, to the district, and then to the powers that be, federal, and all that good stuff. And then can state and district assessments help our students want to learn? The way that they're currently constructed, do these assessments help our students want to learn? Again, emphasis is put on the want because that's personalized, right? Like I said, it's a disposition or an attitude that we're looking to operationalize in this particular sense. So looking at these questions, I want you to consider these questions throughout. Now, getting into what we were talking about, the economic divide, right? About what type of students and what type of areas kind of thrive off of the current testing system that America has adopted. So schools in higher socioeconomic environments usually have higher API scores, higher SAT scores, higher ACT scores, college placement exams, which are all high stakes tests, right? Which are all summative assessments. They generally perform better on high stakes assessments. They do. But then they also utilize formative assessment practices on the regular. And schools in lower socioeconomic environments usually have lower API scores, usually have lower SAT or ACT scores or college placement exam scores. They generally perform lower on high-stake assessments. But the main go-to form of assessment within the lower socioeconomic environments, which again mirror the type of assessments from the United States or the higher socioeconomic environments, they utilize summative assessment practices. And again, students within this particular context versus students within the alternate context usually perform lower because the type of tests that they do and the type of tests that they're continuing to do, it doesn't mesh with their learning styles. It doesn't mesh with their environment and how they have come to learn or to love to learn. in a sense. So this economic divide, it mirrors both testing placements. They mirror the broader scale within the United States of America testing, how we've adopted that. So to go from there, there was a study done by Black and Wiliam in 1998, uncovered 250 articles that addressed whether improved formative assessments would yield higher student achievement as reflected in summative assessments. So basically, how they continue to use formative assessment to inform their learning and inform their teaching, would that have an adverse effect on summative assessments? Or would within summative assessments you see greater student achievement because of those formative assessments that were put in place to tailor teaching to meet students' needs, right? So they discovered that the effects of improved formative assessments on summative test scores yielded significantly positive effects on student achievement. They reported effect sizes of 1/2 to a full standard deviation. Now, for people like me, I need to know, what does that mean? So if we were to put that in our testing, language, it would be gains equivalent to 30 percentile points, right? Or it will be 2 grade level equivalents, or it will be 100 points on the SAT scale. That is huge growth, right? They reported that improved formative assessments specifically helped low achievers more than other students, and that ultimately reduced the range of achievement while raising the achievement overall. So with that, just look at what that said. If you really just take that in, what does that make you think of immediately, right? So taking that information, for districts or schools aiming to reduce achievement gaps between minorities and other students, why are summative assessments still the go-to assessment tool and not formative assessments? So that's a question that I want you guys to answer, and I want you guys to be brutally honest. What do you think, if this is what the research shows, and if we're trying to take students and student achievement and all these things that we're really talking about, that we say that we care about, not what the public sees, not the public report card of API scores and all these other things, but real student achievement. And we see that these type of tests particularly don't work in the favor of students from low-income communities. Why are we continuing to use these summative assessments issued by NCLB or whatever as a tool? And why do we not focus more so on assessment for learning or formative assessments? And then Black and Wiliam, so ultimately what they came to find out is the achievement gains are maximized in contexts where educators increase the accuracy of classroom assessments, provide students with frequent informative feedback versus infrequent judgmental feedback, and involve students deeply in the classroom assessment, record keeping, and communication process. So these are the things that has to happen inside of the classroom. Not just we have to get ready for the benchmark, not just we have to get ready for this week's test, or we have to get ready for XYZ, but it's a deep entrenched relationship that's going on between teacher student to help each other inform learning within the classroom and inform teaching within the classroom to help students become better students, right? So if this is what the data shows, this is the question: why are schools in low-income communities still relying on district-mandated benchmarks for formative assessments and not teacher-created assessments? So again, we look at the benchmarks, and that was talked to again in the chapter 16 about how benchmarks are considered formative assessments. But when we really look at how benchmarks are rolled out and how benchmarks are used, they're not really used to inform teaching or to inform instruction. Particularly, again, it's another form of summative assessments that is some type of report card to see how the school is doing in comparison to other schools. So why do schools in low-income communities, again, use these benchmarks for formative assessments instead of using teacher-created assessments to inform teaching and inform learning, right? And then my other question is, why are schools in low-income communities still administering high-stake tests? I know that they're important. I know those are things that we have to do. It's mandated. But why aren't we supplementing those, right? What's the real purpose? Why are they still using high-stakes testing, right? And then, are we truly moving close to the achievement, or are we truly moving to close the achievement or opportunity gap if high stakes testing practices are prevalent in low income communities. Based off of what the research says, we see that these types of tests, and I'm not going to say there aren't outliers within low income communities that do well on API scores and do well on high stakes tests, but the broad majority of it, why are we still using these as instruments of assessment if we want to close the achievement gap? Why isn't the focus more so on formative assessments, assessments for learning, and preparing teachers to create meaningful assessments within the classroom, student to student, teacher to student, to help inform their teaching practices? So that's my little spiel, and I want that to become kind of like the way you're thinking in this particular point. How do these two entities, how can they coexist together to help better prepare our students? When I say our students, I'm talking about students from low-income communities, students who mirror us, those types of things. Maybe that's not politically correct to say, but that's how I feel. And I thought that the article was very good in what it did, but ultimately I think that this was one of the critiques that I would have. It did not focus on that other aspect of formative assessments that can help students from low-income communities. So this is what I decided to add to the conversation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Here are my references. If you want to read the article, it's there. And if you want to look at the study that Black and William did, it's there as well. And thank you for your time.